Flames were still licking the roof when I pulled up. The fire department was already on site, but it was too late. My grandma's house, the one she'd lived in for 42 years, was a smoldering skeleton of its former self. And standing behind the caution tape, arms folded like this was some kind of neighborhood cleanup, was Karen. Clipboard in hand. Lipstick, perfect. And the audacity to say, well, she was warned. They burned her house down. Over a $9 fine. What kind of monsters think that's proportional? My grandma, Lorraine Matthews, had lived on Sunvale Drive for 42 years. Her house was the only original structure left from before the subdivision got bought up and boxed into the grid of beige conformity known as the cottages at Winding Hills. Her roses were wild, her porch was wide. And the shutters? A deep cranberry red that didn't match a damn thing in the HOA handbook. She was the last breath of personality in a neighborhood that had been strip-mined by sameness, but she never minded. She said the neighbors were friendly, and that as long as she could feed her blue jays and sit with her coffee each morning, it was still home. That piece shattered the morning she got her first violation notice for failure to comply with exterior regulation, 3B. The reason? A crack in her driveway no longer than a ruler. The fine, $9. $9? She laughed over the phone when she told me. They spent more printing the letter. At first, she treated it like a nuisance. She mailed the check the same day, walked it to the HOA drop box herself. If it buys me quiet, she said, it's worth it. But it didn't buy her anything. The next week, another envelope showed up. This one, certified. It accused her of non-responsiveness to a previously issued citation, and said the $9 fine was now $129 due to processing penalties. Grandma had the receipt from her bank, showed it to the HOA rep who came knocking the following morning, clipboard in hand and sunglasses glued to his face like he thought he was with the Secret Service. His name was Glenn. She invited him inside to sit. He refused. Said he was not authorized to enter a non-compliant structure, a house she'd lived in since before he was probably born. She offered to show him the receipt. He told her it wasn't about the receipt. It was about establishing intent to correct. She said, "So I did the right thing too quickly?" And he just wrote something down and walked off. 2 days later, a notice was taped to her front door. Failure to remove unapproved shrubbery. They meant her rosebush, the one her late husband planted with her the week after they bought the house in 1981. The bush was huge now, overflowing with magenta blooms, thorns like little daggers, but it was the pride of the neighborhood, or used to be. Even in the HOA brochure from 10 years ago, her rosebush had made the cover photo. Now, it was a violation. Grandma called to ask if I thought it was targeted. I told her it was probably just a bored HOA committee trying to meet some quota. "But what if they're trying to get rid of me?" she asked. That sentence hit me sideways. Lorraine Matthews was not a woman who panicked. She was tough, sharp, unflinching, the kind of woman who ironed her curtains and balanced a checkbook down to the penny. She didn't get scared. But this felt different, and she was right to be. Over the next 4 weeks, she received 6 more citations, one for improper mailbox alignment, even though the post hadn't moved in decades, one for bird feeders exceeding quantity limits, one for gutter discoloration, which turned out to be a leaf that fell and stained the edge during a storm. Each fine was petty, but cumulative. The total jumped from 9 to 384 to 912 in less than a month. When she tried to call the HOA office, she was rerouted 3 times, then told, all disputes must be submitted via certified mail. When she submitted the dispute, complete with photographs, receipts, and a notarized letter, the next notice she got wasn't an answer. It was a lien. A2 500 property lien marked urgent in red block letters, threatening foreclosure proceedings if she didn't bring the property into full compliance within 14 days. That's when she called me in tears. I hadn't heard her cry since my grandfather's funeral. I drove 4 hours that night to be at her house by morning. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw the crack. Same one from the first fine. Still no bigger than a ruler, maybe 2. There was a neon sticker on the mailbox. stuck crooked, like a war mark. Her rosebush had been hacked in half, dead blooms scattered like a massacre on the lawn. She opened the door before I even knocked. Her face was pale, her hands shook. "They said someone from the board stopped by this morning," she whispered. "Said they were inspecting for structural violations." I told him I already sent in the forms, but he just took pictures and told me I should think about selling before I'm fined out of the neighborhood. The phrase, "fined out of the neighborhood," stuck with me, like it was an actual strategy. I made coffee and had her walk me through every letter, every notice, every accusation. She'd kept them all in a manila folder. It was thicker than a phone book. They dated back months. Some even predated the 9 fine. One was marked "Final Warning" for a gate on her back fence that hadn't latched correctly. A gate I fixed myself the last time I visited. Another accused her of unauthorized painting. Her shutters, they claimed, had been repainted without submitting the HOA's color harmony application. But the shutters hadn't been painted in a decade. Same cranberry red. I could still smell the varnish from the last time I helped her coat them in sealant. This wasn't enforcement. It was warfare disguised as paperwork. One line from a letter stood out more than the rest. It read, "Non-compliant properties create ripple effects of degradation in neighborhood value." The letter was signed by a name I recognized from my background in property law, Marcia DeWitt. The HOA vice president who had previously been sued for predatory code enforcement tactics in a different county. Grandma had no idea. She just wanted her house, her peace, her porch with the rocking chair and her birds. I promised her I'd take care of it. I didn't say how, but the truth is, I knew what this was already. They wanted her out. Not because she was disruptive, not because she'd broken any meaningful rule, but because her home, her beautiful old non-conforming home, wasn't profitable. They wanted it bulldozed, rebuilt, and sold at a markup. Her rosebush, her shutters, her wind chimes, her gravel path, those were obstacles to property values. The 9 fine wasn't a warning. It was the first shot. And my grandma? She was collateral damage in their plan to homogenize and cash out. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They thought she was alone. They thought nobody would care. They thought they could drown her in paper and scare her into silence. What they didn't know, couldn't know, was that I wasn't just her grandson. I was a legal tactician with 3 successful HOA takedowns behind me. And this one, this little HOA that declared war over a 9 fine, had just opened a door they would never be able to close again. I moved into Grandma's spare room the next day. She protested at first, said she didn't want to trouble me, that I had a busy life in the city. But the truth was, I dropped everything. I'd fought bigger battles than this in courtrooms, packed with cameras, judges too cozy with developers, and entire HOA boards funded by real estate syndicates hiding behind limited liability. But this time, it wasn't just strategy. It was personal. And I wasn't about to let her be picked apart by a neighborhood cartel using clipboards as cudgels. The first thing I noticed was how the notices changed tone once I was there. They used to come by mail, neat and formal. Now, they were hand-delivered, sometimes taped to her door in neon green with giant red letters. Final warning. Imminent legal consequences. Sometimes, they weren't taped at all. They were shoved through the mail slot, folded like threats. One morning, I found a man with a measuring wheel pacing the property line at dawn, scribbling on a legal pad and muttering about encroachment violations. I asked who he was with. He said, "Compliance Enforcement, Winding Hills HOA," like it was a badge of honor. I told him he was trespassing and he smirked. Common grounds start 11 inches into her eastern fence line. Technically, I'm on mine. That was day 3. By day 5, I noticed something far more invasive. A small metallic box attached to the streetlight across from her house. I knew that shape. I'd seen that exact model in courtroom evidence before. It was a motion-activated surveillance camera, the kind used by city code enforcement and, sometimes, HOAs that like to blur the line between oversight and stalking. I traced the wire through a weatherproof conduit and found it terminated in a gray lockbox labeled "Property of HOA Infrastructure Zone 3. They were filming her, documenting her every movement, treating her like a suspect in her own home. That afternoon, Grandma called from the kitchen. Her voice was small. They came again. I walked in to see her holding an envelope with shaking hands. Another lien. This one for $3,800. Abandonment of compliance and regulatory negligence, it said. Not just legalese, manufactured guilt. The letter said failure to pay would result in a legal motion to enforce sale of the property. They want to take it, she whispered. They actually want to take it. I'd seen enough. I took the folder, the letters, the photos, and set up a temporary war room in her dining room. I pushed aside the floral centerpiece and spread out the paperwork like I was laying down a battlefield. I started building the chronology, a tactic they never expect. HOA harassment thrives in isolation, in fear, in confusion. But when you stack it, when you line it up and trace the intent, it becomes something else. A pattern. And in legal terms, a pattern means a strategy, and a strategy can be prosecuted. I connected the dots. The original, 9 fine, the rosebush, the denial of receipt, the code violations issued without proper inspection, the surveillance camera installed without notice, the measuring, the liens, the language, escalating, threatening, increasingly punitive. It wasn't random. It was systemic, calculated. By the end of that night, I had what I call the first pillar, documented institutional hostility. I didn't tell them who I was, not yet. As far as they knew, I was just a protective grandson with a bad temper and a strong jawline. Let them think that. It was better they underestimated me. Because, the truth? I was one of the people who helped write the legal framework for how HOAs operate in this state. I had clerked for the judge who ruled on the most important HOA abuse case in state history. I had personally dismantled 3 HOA boards in the last 5 years, using nothing more than their own bylaws and a mountain of subpoenas. But out here in Winding Hills, I was just a guy in jeans and a hoodie. They had no idea what was parked in Grandma's spare bedroom, a legal precision bomb waiting to go off. And every new letter they dropped through that door, that was me pulling the pin a little further. The next morning, I walked to the HOA office. It sat at the center of the neighborhood like a courthouse for the damned all-beige stucco and corporate landscaping, fake smiles painted on by budget decorators. Inside, a receptionist in a floral blouse greeted me with the same voice you use to offer someone a sample at Costco. "Are you here for a complaint or a payment?" she asked. "Both," I said. "My grandmother is Lorraine Matthews. You've been sending her notices." The receptionist's eyes flicked just for a second. Recognition. Maybe even a hint of guilt. "Oh, yes, Ms. Matthews. There have been some issues with her file." "No," I said. "There's been harassment, false violations, illegal surveillance, intimidation tactics, and now fraudulent liens. I want to speak to your general counsel." She blinked. "I think you mean our compliance officer." "No," I said, my voice level. "I mean your lawyer." Silence. I let it sit. "If you don't have one on site, I'll speak to the HOA president. I believe her name is Karen Westbrook." The receptionist's hands fumbled with a desk phone. "She's in a meeting, but I can have someone—" "I'll wait," I said and sat down. 10 minutes later, Karen herself appeared, wearing a tailored blazer, designer flats, and a fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. She extended her hand. "You must be Lorraine's grandson. We've heard a lot." I didn't take her hand. "You'll be hearing more," she laughed, that brittle HOA laugh, then gestured toward the hallway. "Why don't we talk in the boardroom?" The boardroom was a whitewashed rectangle lined with certificates that looked like they were printed at home. The words, "Community First," were stenciled in cursive on the wall. A man in khakis and a golf shirt sat at the end of the table, tapping a pen. Karen sat across from me, eyes like knives wrapped in courtesy. "So," she said, "what seems to be the issue?" I dropped the folder on the table. Harassment, illegal fines, retaliatory enforcement, improper lien procedures, surveillance without notification, selective code application, emotional distress. And as of this morning, I believe we can add elder intimidation. Karen didn't flinch. The man with the pen shifted uncomfortably. "This is quite a list," she said. "And What exactly is your role in all this? I smiled. That tight, surgical kind of smile that lawyers use before they start reading from deposition transcripts. I'm the reason your board has to double-check its insurance coverage starting today. The man with the pen stopped tapping. Karen's eyes narrowed just enough to show the first crack in the facade. You're an attorney? She said, careful now. Litigation, civil procedure, HOA code compliance specialist, former assistant to the State Property Law Commission, and a very pissed-off grandson. Karen sat back. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She didn't even deny it. She just said, well, that's unfortunate. For you, I said. Then I stood, picked up the folder, and walked out without another word. That night, Grandma found me on the porch, looking out at the road. What did you do? She asked. Started building the second pillar, I said. And what's that? Proof of retaliation. I looked out toward the street, where a car had slowed in front of our house 3 times already that day. Let them keep pushing, I whispered. They don't know it yet, but they're walking straight into a trap they've already built for themselves. Grandma sat beside me in silence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because we both knew the war had just officially started, and I was the worst possible person for them to have provoked. It started with the smell, acrid, chemical, wrong. I woke before sunrise to a haze in the hallway, thin at first, like fog on glass, until my lungs clutched on instinct and my eyes burned. The air was thick, metallic, and too quiet. No birdsong, no wind, just the low roar of something that didn't belong. I threw the bedroom door open, and the heat hit like a furnace. The west wall of Grandma's house, her bedroom, her photographs, her reading chair, was a wall of orange light framed in black smoke. My voice ripped through the house. Grandma! I found her at the foot of the stairs, barefoot, dazed, one arm up shielding her face. I grabbed her without a word and pulled her through the kitchen, the back door already hot to the touch. We burst into the yard, coughing, the night air cut by strobing red lights and the screech of sirens still approaching. I turned just long enough to see her roof buckle inward, and then the windows blew out with a sound like thunder underwater. Grandma dropped to her knees, hands trembling, whispering over and over, My house! My house! My house! I pulled my phone and called 911 even though I could already hear them. It wasn't a call for help, it was a witness statement. The flames hadn't finished what they started, but I knew this wasn't natural. A house doesn't go from quiet to engulfed in 90 seconds without help. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the front half of the house had collapsed. Grandma's porch swing, her mailbox with our family name in peeling paint, her rosebush, all of it ash. I stayed with her as the paramedics checked her out and wrapped her in a blanket. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My ears rang. My chest ached. And somewhere beneath all the panic was the cold, serrated edge of clarity. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a message, one the HOA would deeply regret sending. The fire marshal arrived an hour later. Heavy-set, calm, clipped mustache, and state-issue sunglasses. He crouched near the front step with 2 deputies and started his initial walk. I watched him scan the scene, note something in the debris, glance toward the eastern corner of the house, and then look quickly away. That was the first red flag. Most people linger on points of origin. He didn't. He looked once and turned. Too fast. When I approached him 20 minutes later, he was already wrapping up the report. I asked him what he thought caused it. Could be wiring, he said. Old homes, faulty circuits, space heaters. You know how it is. Except I did know how it was. The wiring had been redone 3 years ago. I paid for it myself. The breaker box had a state inspection tag signed and sealed. There were no space heaters in use, and Grandma hadn't touched her thermostat in weeks. What about accelerants? I asked, point blank. Nothing obvious, he said, flipping his notebook closed. We'll file the full report in 72 hours. You'll be notified. Then he nodded, gave a tight smile, and walked back toward the trucks. The deputy with him didn't make eye contact. Red flag number 2. By 9 a.m., the neighborhood had gathered like vultures. Cell phone cameras. Whispered speculation. And then I saw her, Karen, standing on the sidewalk a few houses down, arms folded, sunglasses gleaming, whispering to another board member, a man I recognized from the board meetings. His name was Derek Cole, HOA treasurer, glorified errand boy. He saw me looking and turned away, too fast, but Karen didn't. She held my stare like it was a power play, then gave a slow, slight shake of her head. Not pity, not regret, just satisfaction. I walked toward her. Not running, not yelling, just slow and steady. But before I reached her, she turned and walked back to her Mercedes. The door slammed and she drove off like it was any other Tuesday. That was red flag number 3. That same afternoon, I requested the HOA's surveillance feed from the pole camera installed across from Grandma's property, the one I'd documented days ago. I'd already filed a Freedom of Information request with the City Utilities Office to see if the camera had been registered, which it hadn't. That meant the HOA had installed it on public infrastructure without a permit. Another illegal move in a growing mountain of them. When I called the HOA compliance office and requested the footage between midnight and 5 a.m., the receptionist paused, then said the system had malfunctioned. 4 words that might as well have been a confession. She said no footage existed from that night, that the device had buffered out due to weather conditions. I asked what weather. The skies had been clear. She stuttered, said she'd check. I hung up. That was red flag number 4. By evening, I had spoken to 3 neighbors. Each confirmed something disturbing. One saw a white utility van parked in front of Grandma's house at 3:30 a.m. 2 people in reflective vests walked around the perimeter with flashlights. One neighbor, a retired vet named Russ, said he thought it was just a maintenance inspection until he saw one of them open the fuse box mounted near the porch. That box was scorched now, melted into the siding. The same siding where the fire had clearly originated. Another neighbor, a teenage girl who worked nights at the hospital, said she walked home around 4:00 a.m. and saw a man kneeling near the rosebush with what looked like a metal canister. She didn't think anything of it, thought maybe it was a sprinkler repair. She didn't know what an accelerant can look like. I did. At this point, I was done with whispers. I began the paperwork to file an independent fire investigation. I contacted a private fire analyst I knew from a past case, one who testified against 3 developers that had tried to frame faulty electrical as cover for torching half-built homes to claim insurance. I sent him photos of the damage. He called back 20 minutes later and said, that fire was fed, probably ignited low near ground level, and pushed with an accelerant along a load-bearing wall. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. But here's what chilled me to the bone. That evening, as I combed through what little remained of the porch, I found a slip of paper fused to the underside of the old mailbox. It was scorched, half blackened by flame, but still legible. It was a violation notice, one I hadn't seen before, dated the morning before the fire. It read, Code violation, removal in progress, structure to be abated pending non-compliance ruling. In the corner, written in small print, entry waiver authorized by board vote. I froze. Entry waiver. That meant they had authorized someone to enter the property. Under what authority, I didn't know. It wasn't legal, but it was documented, and that made it traceable. The next day, I went to the county records office and pulled the inspection logs. There were no permits filed for inspection, no abatements pending, no contractor work orders. The citation was a ghost, a phantom letter never filed, never recorded. I asked the clerk if HOA enforcement actions had to be copied to the Municipal Housing Board. She nodded and pulled the last recorded compliance entry from Winding Hills. It was dated 3 weeks ago. The citation I held had never been submitted. That was red flag number 5, and the one that flipped the switch in me. This wasn't incompetence anymore. It was a cover-up. I contacted the state fire marshal's office directly and asked for the full report. The clerk on the other end said it was an internal review. I asked how long that normally takes. She hesitated. Said it had already been marked pending closure. I told her I was a licensed civil litigator, gave my bar ID, and requested the report as a legal courtesy. She paused for a long time, then whispered, "It's been redacted." "By who?" I asked. She wouldn't answer. But she did fax me one page, the incident summary. I read it 5 times. Cause: undetermined. Evidence of accelerants: inconclusive. Surveillance: unavailable. Witnesses: none. That last line made me physically ill. Because I knew for a fact there were witnesses. I had names, testimonies. 2 were willing to go on record. But somehow, their statements never made it into the report. Someone had scrubbed it. Someone with access. Someone protecting someone. Maybe the board. Maybe the marshal himself. Maybe both. It didn't matter. I wasn't going to let them bury it. That night, I walked the ashes. Stepped where Grandma's living room used to be. Found the rusted frame of her rocking chair half melted into the floor. I picked up a chunk of burnt wood, turned it over, and saw the faint imprint of a child's footprint, mine, from decades ago, from when I used to jump off that exact step to race her to the driveway. And I made a promise right then. They thought this fire was the end. But it was just the ignition. They didn't burn down a house. They burned a line in the sand. And I was going to make damn sure they never forgot what came next. By the end of that week, Grandma was living in a spare bedroom at my townhouse, but her voice still cracked every time she said home. Winding Hills was scorched earth now, figuratively and literally. But I wasn't there to rebuild nostalgia. I was there to bury a criminal enterprise in legal concrete. This wasn't going to be a simple lawsuit for damages. Not anymore. The moment they torched her life and buried the arson report under redacted ink, they gave me the opening I needed to unleash something I'd been waiting years to try. A civil RICO case against a homeowners association. It's rare. Almost unheard of. But if you build it right, if you can prove fraud, coercion, illegal asset seizure, and a continuing criminal enterprise under the color of governance, it becomes a federal-level legal nuke. And the beauty of it? They walk right into it while they think they're still in charge. I started with the paper. I went through every citation Grandma had received, traced the signatures, verified the vote records from the HOA's official minutes. And wouldn't you know it, at least 5 of the violations she'd been fined for were issued on dates when the board had no quorum. One of them was signed by a board compliance officer who hadn't been officially appointed until 2 weeks later. Another bore the signature of a man who'd moved out of the neighborhood a year prior. Sloppy. Predictable. Illegal. The liens were worse. I visited the county recorder's office and requested all lien filings submitted by Winding Hills HOA over the past 3 years. The clerk brought me a stack as thick as a brick. As I sifted through them, a pattern emerged. 67 liens filed in under 36 months, nearly all against residents over the age of 60. The language varied, but the outcome was always the same. Stack violations until the fines balloon, then file liens, then initiate foreclosure threats until the resident voluntarily sells. I cross-referenced sale records. 22 homes had changed hands during that period. 17 had sold to entities tied to a shell LLC called Clearbridge Properties. I traced the registration. An office suite in a different state, no listed website, and one single point of contact, Derek Cole, the HOA's treasurer. The same man I'd seen whispering with Karen at the fire scene. I ran the LLC through public record aggregation software and uncovered 3 more: Ironbend LLC, Alta Creek Holdings, and Maple Edge Ventures, all connected by tax ID crossover and common mailing addresses. They were laundering homes through corporate shells, turning HOA harassment into a real estate churn. But harassment wasn't enough. RICO demands a pattern, a playbook of intimidation, and proof that they knew it was wrong and did it anyway. That's where my trap came in. I filed a fake estate transfer notice with the county, made it look like Grandma's burned-out property was being passed to a trust operated by a fictional cousin. I used a shell trust name and listed an elderly woman, Marjorie Hill, as the executor. Marjorie didn't exist, but the house she moved into did. It was owned by a friend of mine, a retired judge who let me stage the house with an elderly woman playing the role. She puttered around the yard in a sun hat, planted a few flowers, and left a walker by the front steps. I installed cameras everywhere, discrete ones in the trees, motion-activated ones at the mailbox, and a high-res lens aimed at the back gate. Then I waited. It didn't take long. On day 4, 2 members of the HOA board showed up. They didn't knock. They walked the perimeter, took photos of the non-existent violations, and opened the fuse box without permission. The woman playing Marjorie stepped outside, waved, and asked if she could help them. One of them told her to stay inside before she tripped on something and caused legal exposure. The other said, and I quote, "We'll get this cleared out in 2 weeks." Just like the last one. I played that video on repeat for an hour, not because I needed to, but because it made the case airtight. That statement alone was evidence of premeditated coercion, intent to mislead, and a systemic plan to displace residents under the guise of compliance. When I had enough, I started tipping off the press. Not the tabloids, the right ones. Local news first. A reporter named Dana Croft with a reputation for exposing city corruption. I sent her a carefully worded tip, no names, just, anonymous whistleblower reveals predatory property seizure racket hiding inside a suburban HOA. Elderly victims. Possible arson. She replied within an hour. 2 days later, the headline hit page 1. Neighborhood nightmare. Seniors pushed out by HOA enforcement. New owner linked to board. The phone didn't stop ringing. Residents who'd been too afraid to speak up before started sending me pictures, records, stories. One woman showed me how they'd fined her $250 for noise pollution after her husband used an electric leaf blower for 12 minutes. Another man, a retired Navy mechanic, said his shed had been condemned and bulldozed while he was in the hospital for hip surgery. They left a note saying it was an unauthorized storage structure. His tools, gone. His vintage motorcycle, scrapped. And then came the big break. One resident, a former IT administrator, came forward with access to the HOA's internal server. It wasn't protected, no password rotation. He downloaded months of emails, meeting minutes, and internal documents. The files were staggering. Board members referring to elderly homeowners as low-liability transitions. One email from Karen to Derek read, "Offer below appraisal, cite lien pressure. They'll fold like the last one." Another email joked, "Call it enforcement, not eviction." Sounds cleaner. I filed the formal RICO complaint with the State Attorney General's office, backed by 2 binders of hard evidence and 23 notarized witness affidavits. I didn't expect a response right away. I got one the next morning. The Attorney General's assistant called me directly. She said, "Mr. Matthews, the AG has flagged your case as high priority. Are you prepared to testify under oath and provide full disclosure?" I said, "You bring the judge, I'll bring the matches." By the end of the week, Winding Hills HOA was the subject of 3 state-level investigations. One from the Attorney General's office, one from the Department of Consumer Affairs, and one from the State Bar, triggered by allegations that the HOA's contracted legal counsel had knowingly filed unlawful liens. The pressure cracked the board in half. The treasurer, Derek Cole, disappeared. No resignation letter, no notice, just gone. His house listed for sale by owner with a price tag well below market value. 2 other board members publicly resigned via Facebook posts filled with defensive language and half apologies. Karen, however, doubled down. She released a formal statement claiming the HOA was under attack by a coordinated smear campaign led by disgruntled residents and outside agitators. It backfired. Comments flooded the post. "My mom cried for a week when you destroyed her swing. You ruined my dad's last 6 months on Earth with threats and citations. You knew, you just didn't care. I knew the time was coming." The board was fractured. The press had blood in the water. The state had subpoena, power, and motive. But I wasn't done. I wanted them to feel it, to watch the walls they built collapse on top of them, one fraudulent policy at a time. And so I waited. Because when your enemy is digging their own grave, you don't interrupt. You just sharpen the shovel. The courtroom was quiet, too quiet for what was about to happen. Sunlight streamed through the stained windows of Division 3C, catching dust motes in its beams like spotlights waiting for the final act. On one side sat Karen, flanked by her remaining loyalists, her hair too perfect for someone about to be buried in legal ruin. On my side, me, 4 witnesses, 2 hard drives, 1 retired judge, a rolling cart of evidence, and an assistant attorney general who had taken one look at my civil RICO filing and said, without blinking, "This is the most airtight systemic corruption case I've seen in 20 years. I didn't wear a suit. I wore what I wore when they came for Grandma: jeans, jacket, no tie. Because I wasn't here to look like justice. I was here to be it." The judge took her seat, opened the file, and cleared her throat. Matthews v. Winding Hills HOA, docket number 34117A. We are here to determine the validity of claims related to alleged civil racketeering, elder abuse, fraudulent liens, malicious property acquisition, and willful endangerment resulting in arson. Plaintiff, proceed. I stood and said 2 words, "Your Honor." Then I pressed play. A projector lit up the screen with the clip I'd saved for last, the so-called Marjorie Hill trap. There it was. Derek Cole, now vanished, on video, telling my elderly decoy neighbor she'd be out in 2 weeks, just like the last one. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. I followed with stills, forged lien documents, a list of illegally filed foreclosures, emails showing Karen laughing at a disabled homeowner's lawn citation. Then came the bomb, an internal HOA memo titled Low Resistance Inventory that ranked residents by likelihood to resist compliance threats. Grandma was on it. So were 17 others. Most of them were gone now. Houses sold. Assets transferred. Lives disrupted beyond repair. Then I dropped the witness statements, one after another, each voice stronger than the last. The mechanic whose garage had been demolished without notice. The elderly widow threatened with fines because her husband's veteran flag was non-standard. The woman whose house was bulldozed after a fraudulent condemnation. Then came the arson report, full, unredacted. Obtained via court order with the help of the AG's office. It clearly listed the cause of ignition as accelerant-fueled ignition at ground level consistent with human placement. I read it aloud, slowly, clearly. Human placement. Karen shifted for the first time. The tremor in her hand betrayed her. But I wasn't done. I raised my voice one final time. This was not negligence. This was not bureaucracy. This was a coordinated attack on vulnerable homeowners for financial gain. The Winding Hills HOA was not a homeowners association. It was a criminal enterprise wearing khakis and polos, weaponizing procedure to steal lives and properties. And now, it is time they are treated accordingly. The judge didn't hesitate. Her ruling came down like a thunderclap. Civil RICO judgment for the plaintiff. Damages in the amount of $1.2 million plus court fees, punitive damages, and immediate court-ordered dissolution of the Winding Hills HOA, effective immediately. A criminal referral is submitted for all named defendants. This court stands adjourned. She slammed the gavel. That sound is still echoing in my bones. Karen didn't leave the courtroom. A sheriff's deputy stood behind her before she even stood up. He touched her shoulder gently, but firmly. "Ms. Westbrook, you are under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit property theft. Please stand." She did, barely. She glanced at me with the same eyes she used on Grandma all those months ago, condescending, smug, invincible. Only this time, there was a flicker beneath the surface. Not confusion, not guilt. Recognition. The kind of recognition a predator feels when it realizes it just stepped into a cage. The courtroom emptied. My phone buzzed non-stop with messages, reporters, former residents, attorneys from other states asking for the template of the suit, but I ignored them. I had somewhere more important to be. 2 weeks later, on a crisp fall morning, I stood in front of the now condemned Winding Hills HOA office. The court had found it in violation of 16 separate building codes, lack of occupancy permits, misuse of electrical infrastructure, unlicensed security cameras wired into public utilities, and unregistered drone equipment in the back room. The judge ordered it seized, shut down, and scheduled for demolition. But I pulled one final string. I requested, and was granted, the right to be present when it happened. So I stood there with a cup of coffee in one hand, Grandma's rosebush ashes in the other, and I watched as the backhoe took its first bite into the beige stucco facade. A crack ran through the front like lightning. A shutter snapped off. Then the front wall collapsed like a house of cards, revealing file cabinets and abandoned office chairs. With one more swing, the entire roof caved in, and that was it. The last trace of their empire. Dust rose like smoke from a battlefield. The air filled with silence. And for the first time in months, I breathed. Legally. Finally. Peacefully. The insurance payout came quick. With damages, interest, and legal fees, Grandma was awarded enough to live anywhere she wanted for the rest of her life. But she didn't choose to start over. She chose to stay with me. We bought a small cabin 2 hours away, surrounded by trees and no HOA within 50 miles. We planted a new rosebush together. It's already growing wild. But that wasn't the end. The case made headlines in every major paper across the state. HOA abuse laws were finally thrust into the spotlight. A state senator, whose own mother had been fined for hanging laundry, reached out. He asked if I would help draft a legislative bill to prevent predatory HOA practices. I said yes. We called it the Matthews Bill. It passed 61-0. It guarantees transparency in lien filings, independent oversight boards, and criminal penalties for any association found exploiting homeowners under false citations. And now, every time an HOA board thinks about issuing a fine to someone's grandma for a crack in the driveway, they remember what happened on Sunvale Drive. They remember the fire, the trial, the arrest. And they remember what it looks like when a system that feeds on fear is fed into the legal furnace and burned to the ground, not with vengeance, with law, with truth. With justice that doesn't just punish, but prevents. As for Grandma, she sits on the porch every morning, coffee in hand, watching birds land on the feeder that doesn't match anything in the neighborhood. Because out here, there is no neighborhood code. Just peace. Just family. Just freedom. The last thing I hung on the wall in our new living room was a framed photo of her old house, before the smoke, before the fear, back when it was just a home filled with sunlight and the smell of fresh coffee. Underneath it, I put a plaque with one sentence. They tried to bury her with paperwork. She made sure they were buried in court orders.